In just 100 days, more than 500,000 people were wiped off the map in one of the fastest and most brutal genocides in modern history. Rwanda, a small country in Central Africa, became the stage for neighbors turning on neighbors, families destroying families, and a nation collapsing into horror at a speed the world had never seen before. But this didn't erupt out of nowhere. The seeds of hate had been planted for decades through colonial favoritism, political manipulation, and non-stop propaganda that convinced ordinary citizens to see their friends and co-workers as enemies. The result? A wave of violence so shocking that even the United Nations stood frozen, unable or unwilling to stop it. Long roots of division. Long before the bloodshed of 1994, Rwanda was already a land marked by subtle but powerful divisions. The country's earliest inhabitants were the Twa, a small community of hunter-gatherers. But centuries later, two larger groups, Hutus and Tutsis, settled in the region. At first, their differences weren't about race, but about livelihood. Hutus farmed the land, while Tutsis raised cattle. For generations, these roles shaped status. Owning cattle meant prestige, while farming was seen as more common. By the 18th century, Rwanda was united under a Tutsi king. That moment cemented a hierarchy. Hutus became the majority, but Tutsis dominated political and military power. What had once been differences of lifestyle hardened into lines of privilege and resentment. Neighbors still lived side by side, spoke the same language, and shared the same traditions. But beneath the surface, inequality was growing. And when colonial powers arrived, they wouldn't just deepen those divisions, they would weaponize them. Colonial poisoning. When European colonizers carved up Africa in the late 19th century, Rwanda was handed first to Germany, then to Belgium after World War I. And with them came something far more dangerous than foreign rule: the obsession with race. The Belgians decided that the Tutsis, taller and cattle-owning, must be naturally superior. They flooded them with privileges, top jobs, and political influence, while the Hutu majority was pushed aside. But it wasn't just favoritism. Belgium made identity permanent. Every Rwandan was forced to carry a card labeling them as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. That single piece of paper could determine your future, your education, your job, your opportunities. What had once been a flexible social divide now became an unbreakable wall. For decades, resentment built. The Hutu majority lived under Tutsi dominance, knowing that the system wasn't just unfair, it was written into law. And when independence came, that resentment was ready to explode. Independence and early violence. By the late 1950s, the weight of inequality could no longer be contained. In 1959, an attack on a Hutu politician by Tutsi extremists lit the match. Rumors spread that he had been killed, and almost instantly, violence broke out. Hutu groups struck back, Tutsi communities were targeted, and the Belgian authorities, either unwilling or unable, stood by as chaos unfolded. When elections followed in 1960, Hutus won by a landslide, and 2 years later, Rwanda gained independence. The Tutsi king was exiled, and power shifted into Hutu hands. But independence did not bring peace. Instead, waves of retaliation swept the country. Attacks and counterattacks drove nearly 300,000 Tutsis to flee into neighboring countries. In exile, many of them formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, a movement determined to return home by force if necessary. Meanwhile, inside Rwanda, distrust hardened into hatred. The Hutu government built its power on the promise of keeping Tutsis out, and the seeds of a much larger catastrophe were being sown. Rise of Hutu power. By the 1980s, the wounds of the past had not healed. They had been sharpened into weapons. As exiled Tutsis organized under the RPF abroad, the Hutu-led government inside Rwanda doubled down on fear and hate. Out of this came the ideology known as Hutu power. It was written down in chilling form, the Hutu 10 Commandments. This manifesto declared Hutus superior, demanded complete separation from Tutsis, and warned that anyone who dared to marry or even cooperate with them was a traitor. In the schools, in the churches, in everyday life, this poisonous message spread. But words weren't the only preparation. Weapons poured into the country under the excuse of civil defense. Machetes by the tens of thousands were imported and quietly stockpiled. Militias like the Interahamwe, those who stand together, and the Impuzamugambi, those with the same goal, were trained and indoctrinated with hate. And to fuel the fire, a new weapon weapon was unleashed, the radio. Radio Télévision Libre des Mille Collines blasted anti-Tutsi propaganda day and night, calling them cockroaches and urging listeners to act. Slowly, hate became normalized. Neighbors were no longer neighbors. They were the enemy. The powder keg was set. All it needed was a spark, the trigger. On the night of April 6, 1994, a plane carrying Rwanda's president, Juvenal Habyarimana, was shot out of the sky as it prepared to land in Kigali. The explosion lit up the night, and with it the final spark that ignited a genocide. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired the missile. Some point to the RPF, others to Hutu extremists who wanted an excuse to unleash the violence they had been planning for years. But the truth is, the identities of the killers almost didn't matter. Within hours, roadblocks appeared across the capital. Death lists, carefully prepared in advance, were handed out to militias. Moderate Hutu leaders who favored compromise were assassinated that very night. The prime minister, judges, party leaders, even their families. Anyone who could have calmed the storm was silenced. The propaganda machine roared to life, blaming the Tutsis and urging revenge. Radios screamed orders for work to begin, a coded word for killing. Neighbors were told to rise up against neighbors. And by dawn, the streets of Kigali were already running with blood. The 100 days of horror had begun. 100 days of hell. The morning after the president's plane was shot down, Rwanda erupted. Across the country, roadblocks appeared almost overnight. Soldiers and militias demanded to see identity cards, and a single word, Tutsi, could be a death sentence. Those marked for death were slaughtered on the spot, their bodies dragged into ditches by the roadside. Churches, once sanctuaries, became killing grounds. At Gikondo Parish, more than 100 people were murdered as Polish priests and UN observers looked on helplessly. Days later, at a Kigali technical school, nearly 2,000 men, women, and children were massacred after UN peacekeepers were ordered to withdraw. There were countless stories like these, families herded into buildings only for militias to set them ablaze or cut them down inside. Sexual violence became another weapon of war. Between 250,000 women were assaulted, many by men deliberately released from hospitals with HIV, turned into instruments of slow death. For those who survived, the terror would never leave them. And it wasn't just militias. Ordinary civilians, neighbors, co-workers, even friends were pressured to take part. Refusing to kill could mean being branded a sympathizer and meeting the same fate as the victims. Within weeks, entire communities vanished. This wasn't random chaos. It was organized destruction. And while Rwanda bled, the world watched in silence. International failure. As Rwanda descended into chaos, the world had the power to act, but chose not to. The United Nations had troops on the ground, but their orders tied their hands. Their mission was to observe and assist, not to fight. When 10 Belgian peacekeepers were captured, tortured, and killed, Belgium pulled out its forces entirely. Instead of reinforcing the mission, the UN reduced its presence at the very moment Rwanda needed protection the most. The United States, haunted by its disastrous intervention in Somalia just a year earlier, wanted nothing to do with another African crisis. Officials avoided even using the word genocide, knowing that doing so would obligate them to intervene under international law. France, meanwhile, was accused of siding with the Hutu-led government to protect its own influence in the region. And while Rwanda burned, the world's attention was elsewhere. In Europe, the war in Yugoslavia drew swift international action and massive peacekeeping deployments. But in Rwanda, aid was slow, limited, and politically timid. The message was clear. Genocide in Africa did not provoke the same urgency as bloodshed in Europe. For the victims, this silence was more than betrayal. It was complicity. The turn of the tide. By July 1994, the slaughter was slowing. Not because of mercy, but because there were fewer victims left to kill. 2/3 of Rwanda's Tutsi population had already been wiped out. Yet what ultimately ended the genocide was not international intervention, but the advance of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. Backed by Uganda, the RPF swept through the country, defeating government troops and seizing territory with surprising speed. On July 4th, RPF forces captured Kigali, effectively toppling the regime. 2 weeks later, they seized the last stronghold in Gisenyi. The genocidal government collapsed, and leaders fled into exile. But their departure triggered another humanitarian catastrophe. Over 2 million Hutus, many fearing revenge, fled into neighboring countries like Zaire and Tanzania. Tanzania. Refugee camps swelled overnight, and some became breeding grounds for militias regrouping across the border. And while the scale of killing dropped sharply, the violence didn't disappear. In the aftermath, Tutsi-led forces carried out their own reprisals, targeting Hutus in a cycle of vengeance. The world may have called the genocide over, but Rwanda was far from healed. In just 100 days, Rwanda witnessed one of the fastest genocides in human history. Nearly 1 million lives were lost, not in distant battlefields, but in homes, churches, and neighborhoods, often at the hands of people's own neighbors. This wasn't an ancient feud between strangers. Hutus and Tutsis had lived side by side for centuries, speaking the same language and sharing the same traditions. What tore them apart was manipulation, propaganda, politics, and the deliberate weaponization of fear. The Rwandan genocide is remembered today not only for its staggering scale, but also for the silence of the world that watched it unfold. While Europe received swift military responses during its conflicts, Rwanda was left to bleed alone. The lesson is chilling: when hate is normalized and when powerful nations look away, the result can be catastrophic. But Rwanda's story also forces us to ask, how fragile is peace, really? And how easily can ordinary people be turned against one another when leaders choose division over unity? Those are questions that still matter far beyond Rwanda's borders, and they are questions we can't afford to ignore. History isn't just about the past, it's about the warnings we carry into the present. The Rwandan genocide showed us how quickly ordinary people can be pulled into extraordinary darkness. If you believe stories like this need to be remembered and shared, don't let them fade. Hit that subscribe button to join us as we uncover more hidden chapters of history. Drop a comment with your thoughts or questions. We'd love to hear how you reflect on these events. And if this story moved you, give the video a like so more people can learn what happened when the world looked away. Because remembering isn't just honoring the past, it's protecting the future.